Just,
Yeah,
Good afternoon. Welcome to Collaboration for Innovation, COSIN Google Hangout on Air. I'm Ann Ware, and I serve as COSIN's Project Director for Collaboration for Innovation, a collaboration between COSIN and the Panasonic Foundation, and I'll serve as your moderator today. We apologize, we had a little bit of technical difficulty, and if you're still with us, we're really glad you are, and you're in for a real treat. This collaborative work between the Panasonic Foundation and COSIN supports the work of about 15 district leadership teams across our nation who are committed to breaking the links between poverty, race, educational outcomes for all. And for us, all means all. At this time, Scott Thompson, Assistant Executive Director of the Panasonic Foundation, will bring some brief welcoming remarks to this Google Hangout. Scott?
Yes, good afternoon. We're really glad to finally get connected with everyone, and we're so pleased to have Dr. Yvette Jackson with us this afternoon. She is a scholar, author, and leader, but beyond that, she has substantial experience as a district-based practitioner, and our reason really for inviting her this afternoon to lead this event, along with a follow-up Google Hangout on November 18th, has to do with the depth and clarity of the insight that she has on issues that are really at the heart of what's required to break the links between race, poverty, and educational outcomes. And that's what Panasonic Foundation is all about. That's what the Consortium for School Networking and C4I are all about, and that's what this event this afternoon is about. So we are incredibly fortunate to have Dr. Yvette Jackson leading this event today. Very excited to have her.
Thank you, Scott.
Scott, if I can, I'd like to share with them a little bit about Dr. Jackson. And at this point in time, we can't see you, so you might want to turn your cameras on, and then we'll continue.
You can't see Yvette, or you can't?
Can't see either one of you right now.
Oh, it's showing up on our screen, but yeah.
Okay. Then we'll continue then, and I'm going to see if I can quick question for everyone that's with us today. Can you see the slides?
I can see the slides.
Great. Just want to make sure that we can do that because I'm having a little bit of problems with them. Hang on for just 1 second. There we go. Okay, let me tell you a little bit about Dr. Jackson. She's internationally recognized for her work in assessing the learning potential of disenfranchised urban students. And we will hear about her research in literacy and gifted education and cognitive mediation theory. Dr. Jackson, I hope I said that correctly.
You did.
She currently, again, serves as the Chief Executive Officer of the National Urban Alliance for Effective Education. So I'm now going to turn it over to her on the screen. You can see examples of things that we will be talking about. And without further ado, Dr. Jackson.
Okay, thank you very much, Ann. And so if we just move to my first slide, I think the best way to start this is just to give you a little bit of history. When I was teaching, I always wondered, what is it that's done for students who are labeled as gifted that everybody could really benefit from? And that, to me, is the key to breaking the link, because so much has been focused on underachieving students in terms of looking at their weaknesses that it's almost forgotten that these children have not only incredible strengths, but they have an innate potential for high intellectual performance. That's the second thing I want to address, because usually with urban students particularly, the most that is talked about is literacy for them. And literacy is not high intellectual performance. They are great tools, but they are not high intellectual performance. So what is it that we should do? And without that kind of focus, especially in urban schools, we will never have the kind of transformation that people write about in their wonderful vision statements and their mission and their strategic plans, and wonder, with even everybody contributing, why aren't they seeing that kind of success? And I want to venture to say that the biggest reason is because we have to approach education for all children as gifted education. In other words, what do? You start with their strengths, you invite them to push their intelligence forward, you give them the support based on their strengths, and you give them an enormous amount of enrichment. That is really what everybody should have. So we're going to look very closely at that and the application of that into being a mediative leader, whether you're a superintendent, whether you're a principal in a school. How do you push people into this, joining you in this belief about these children? Next slide, Ann. And so that is where we're going to start here. Why is it that if I'm talking about strengths, then I'm really looking at an assets-driven focus? So the question then becomes for probably many people, especially people in urban schools, why is an asset-driven focus on high intellectual performance is critical for transforming practice to ensure high achievement for all students? Everybody knows the Panasonic mantra that all really means all, and so we're going to talk about that now in terms of this aspect. Where do we get the all from? How do we ensure that we're really getting to that? Next slide. So, to begin this work, I like to call this a pedagogy of confidence. And to me, the confidence is not just about the teachers, it's not just about the students, it's about you leaders who are out there who have to come to the table, underscore this belief really that you're going to be able to move your schools enormous amounts in some cases, or even in schools that might seem to be high achieving, are you achieving as high as you really could be? And so to push that effort, the idea of a pedagogy of confidence is to look at the science behind learning and high achievement. When you know the science, when you are armed and tooled with this background information, you can be much more confident about strategies and practices and structures you put in place that really is going to transform or are going to transform your schools. So we're going to take a little bit of time to talk about this science from both a cognitive and a neuroscience perspective. As I said, how can you push students to high intelligence if we're not sure really how that happens? Next slide. So in this pursuit, again, we're getting here, we're looking at this in terms of breaking those links that we know hold children back, and that gets us to, again, this idea of transformation. I just mentioned to you that we're going to look at the science, because if you're going to transform a school district, the most important critical element is belief. Belief. You can even see in terms of the new Common Core state standards, really the implied understanding is that you really believe all children are capable of being college and career ready. When you don't have that belief, you can't get students there. The other thing I would say is, do you know that student success is 100% contingent upon a teacher's, a school district's belief and the students' ability for higher performance, and for the teachers to believe they have the tools to elicit. So again, I'm using that word belief. Next slide. So again, as we go through this idea of breaking links, I want to move back again and talk a little bit more about belief. You see, without belief, then there is no idea of possibilities. And so how do you move a school district in a transformative way if teachers, if students, if the people at the district office can't envision what the possibilities are? Just moving students up 3 points on a school test is not a new vision for education. So the only way we can get this new vision is this belief in that innate potential that all students have. Next slide. So that's where we now get to the next aspect of transformation. The first is the idea of belief, but the second is illumination. What is it that you do as a leader in a district to illuminate others so they will in fact believe in this innate potential? And that's where we're going to go next. Next slide. So what you'll see here, I love this slide because it really talks about what's in the brain. And so what you'll see here is that the brain is made up of 86 to 100 million neurons. And of course, this is an approximation, but if you know that the brain has all of these neurons that when connected, you are programmed really, you are wired for high intellectual performance with all of these neurons. It is innate, everybody. Now, obviously, that means that everybody is not going to achieve at everything at the highest rates, but what they will achieve at are those things that they are most passionate about, and they have been tooled with the support to get there so that they can follow through on their passions. So we're going to look at that now in terms of this understanding that we're wired for this. So how do we key into that so that transformation happens first with students, so they not only can transform themselves, but can get out there and then be part of transforming the world, but giving the teachers this tools that make them confident that they're able to do that. Next slide. I always like to start with this slide because it gives us a little more about those neurons that we're talking about that get students to high intellectual performance. And what you'll notice here is that you have a picture of a neuron that has these dendrites, these branches, but there's also one axon, or what looks like a dendrite, that really has these a coating around it. It's longer. Every neuron only has one axon that connects with another neuron. The important part here is through enrichment you get a lot of dendrites. We want a lot of that branches that can show growth in the brain, but this axon is very important because around the axon has something that's called a myelin sheath. That's like insulation, and so when you get high insulation around that axon, what winds up happening is that thinking and connecting among neurons becomes much more efficient, much more effective, much quicker. So of course, for us as those educators, the question becomes, so how do we make that myelin sheath thicker so that students can optimize what is already innately wired? And the things that we have learned now from neuroscience are twofold. First of all, by helping students connect to their past information, their cultural frame of reference, actually having them speak about what they already know in relation to something they're learning, large and conceptual, and what teachers may not think initially has a lot to do with this new concept that they're covering, and yet from a student perspective may be exactly what they need to see why a teacher is taking them on this course to learn this new information. So that's number one. But the second, and this is where it's critical, to be able to effectively build this myelin sheath, we need to be starting more with student strengths. And why? Because the stronger a connection is among neurons indicates that there's been exposure and there's been a lot of practice and deep interest in an area. That's where we start getting the effectiveness in terms of the links for learning. So think about this. In underperforming schools, we are so used to starting where students are weak that we are going exactly opposite the effectiveness of how the brain can operate. This really flips a script in terms of looking at moving students along. And so you might say, well, yes, students have strengths, but what about their weakness? How do we still get to those weaknesses? And I will profess to you that the best way is by starting with strengths and using students' strengths to, in fact, address the areas that they're weak. And we'll talk a little bit more about that in a bit. But there are two more things I want to say here. What you'll see at the bottom right of the slide are two words, endorphins and dopamine. They are both what are called neurotransmitters. Neurotransmitters are the chemicals that go off in the brain to help strengthen connections among neurons. They help to really be like catalysts for that kind of coding around the axons that I was just talking about. So the question becomes, where do these neurotransmitters come into the process? What we also know now from neuroscience, the more you start with the student's strengths, even getting them to just talk about the strengths, the body lets off these endorphins that then help the connectivity. The exact opposite happens when you're starting with weaknesses. The body lets off inhibitors that are something that's called cortisol that breaks down connections. So the more we start with where students are weak, the more we focus on them and use that as the starting point, the less connectivity you actually get. And that becomes a problem. Next slide. So as we're going through this idea of neuroscience, again, why am I sharing this? Because the more we know how the brain works, the better choices we can make to literally get into that transformation that I was talking about. So we're starting with strengths. The other thing, again, especially in urban schools where we're talking about underperformance, we say, well, what is it that the brain is always seeking? For particular things, it is always seeking engagement. So when people say that children are not motivated, my first question always is, well, what do you do to engage them? Because you see, the brain is always, always looking to be engaged. And if it's not getting engaged in a classroom, it will look to get engaged some other place. How do we get to that engagement? When you start with someone's strengths, what they're interested on, you immediately get their engagement. The next is the brain always wants to be challenged. So when we do remedial kind of work with children, they are not feeling challenged. And sometimes people say, well, if you have a challenge, perhaps the child doesn't have the skill. Well, the idea is start with skill areas that are strong, teach the new needed skills, and then you start working towards this idea of giving things to students that will challenge them. The brain always is thinking on high levels. The application to new, what might be academic sources, may not be there. But the brain is always analyzing. It's always evaluating. It's always coming up with reasoning. That's natural. Where the gap happens to happen is when there's not a link between this ability and what it is that students are feeling is within their frame of reference. The last two things are that the brain's always looking for feedback and reflection. Next slide. So that if we now know this about the brain and that all students have the wiring, the question then becomes, why do so many students of color experience underachievement? So the first thing I want to say about that is, let's take away students of color, meaning their exterior color. You see, everybody's brain is gray. Everyone's brain is gray. So if we start with understanding how that gray matter works, then we can make better choices about students of color. The one thing that we know, and I'd like you to go to the next slide, is that when you think about something like the Common Core standards, I love to share this one because particularly in terms of the English side, and then we'll look at math, if you quickly breeze through what you will notice in the Common Core state standards, they are expecting that students not only demonstrate independence, not only have high content knowledge, but if you go all the way down to the bottom, it says that they should understand perspectives of others. Now, I share this with you because usually we're not thinking about the fact that the Common Core standards are not just looking at skills, but they're looking at behaviors. They're looking at habits of mind, how you nurture in a child. Students of color, this idea of feeling resilient, this idea of being able to persist, this idea of coming up with questions. That's what we're talking about in terms of behaviors. And so the idea here is you have to engage students with these kinds of content that's going to stimulate a lot of discussion and a lot of interest to get them into those kind of behaviors. If you look at the math side, you'll quickly look down and say the Common Core standards are looking for high levels of thinking. So when we think about remedial work and starting with students' weaknesses, we'll never get to the levels of thinking not only are they capable of, but that's going to be required to move into this idea of being college and career ready. So again, back to this idea of belief that one, students have the capacity, and two, that we want to illuminate ourselves and our staffs about what this propensity or potential of the brain is and look at why it's so needed to be able to get to these high levels of thinking and to cultivate the behaviors that are going to get students to a point of feeling independent and skilled. Next slide. And that's where this particular frame comes in. I always like to share this. We've talked so far about the neuroscience aspect, the idea of the brain, the neurons, and the biology, meaning those neurotransmitters that get let off in the brain when students are talking about strengths or when they're pushed around their weaknesses, neuroinhibitors. But this is really critical. What you'll notice in this slide is I have cognition in the middle because we're talking about ways of learning. What do we need to know? So now we know about innate potential, but what about putting that potential to work so students can understand and so they can learn? So if we were in conversation, I would ask you to translate or to interpret this slide. And what you'll notice is two things are very critical. I have a frame of reference that's very important. What a student values, what's important to them, what they've been exposed to, the kinds of information that they know is their cultural frame of reference. And it's this frame of reference that informs not only the ways they know things, but what they decide to focus in on. The other, you'll notice that language comes between here. Language is so critical. It gets affected by culture. Your culture affects your language, and your language affects your thinking. How you're going to interpret ideas or how you're going to view the world, your perspective, your point of view. All of this, though, is contingent upon that frame of reference. And so many times what happens in urban schools, especially with students of color, their frames of reference, what they are familiar with, are not tapped into when new information is being introduced. And that's why we have to start in a large conceptual way, and I'll talk more again about that later, is we have to be able to make those bridges and allow students to talk about why something or how something they're being introduced them to could remind them of something they're more familiar with, and why there is this connection between what they already know and what's being introduced. It's that frame of reference. Next slide. And so again, that whole idea of the frame of reference is so important because it's not only for interpretation and inferring knowledge, but this whole idea of goal setting. So many times people say, well, our students don't think about the future and what's going to really be happening for them. Two things there. First of all, that's natural for students to live in the present. But two, when there's not a belief in your ability, you do not think about setting goals. And when there's not a connection to where you are, you can't think about projecting forward. So this frame of reference really becomes critical. Next slide. And it's exactly this point that becomes what we call disregarded realities, that our children, they might come in with some weaknesses, but they have incredible strengths. There are barriers outside of school that may keep them from developing those strengths, but you know what? There are also barriers within schools, within school districts, that keep students from developing that innate potential, especially if we think about always focusing on their weaknesses and not making that connection to those cultural frame of references. And so sometimes people will say to me, well, what does that mean? Do I have to learn the culture of 43 students in my class? The best answer to that is students will tell you their culture. When you put out new concepts to learn and students tell you what this is, how this is familiar to them, or what they recognize about it, or why it's important to them, they are sharing their cultural frame of reference with you. So we can't disregard the realities that these students not just come to school with what might be weaknesses, but that they have enormous strengths. That is the reality, and their culture is a strength. It's not a weakness, it's not a barrier, it's actually a strength when we build upon that. Next slide. And so we've been talking about this whole idea of the neuroscience and now the cognitive side frame of reference. And what I have here is just showing that when students can't connect to what's personally relevant, then they go through what we call sociocultural deprivation. They're deprived of the lens that they need to be able to help them translate and build new knowledge upon. That's the foundation. Again, it's back to that frame of reference. I want to take you to the next slide that really gets into understanding the frame of reference concept from a neurobiological stance. We've thought about it from a cognitive with a frame of reference, but think about it this way. Our brain takes in 2 million, or is open to 2 million bits of data a second. There's just enormous data is coming to us from all 5 of our senses. But only about 147 bits of that information can actually be processed at a time. So the brain has within it something that's called the reticular activating system. That means it's that kind of a narrowing in, a telescopic in on a focus. That's what this, and it's called a RAS, happens to do. Now, where does that focusing, how does that happen? How does the brain know or decide what to focus in on? Well, it gets back to that idea of what's culturally important, what children have been exposed to, what they have experienced, and what they think is really relevant and meaningful. So without getting that kind of connection culturally, then this particular system in the brain does not know what to really focus in on, or it chooses something different to focus in on, and that's not getting students to what they really need for getting through the learning experience that the teacher is setting up. Next slide. And so the other side of this is when you don't click in, when the brain cannot focus in, as I was just talking about, based on a frame of reference, then a child goes through stress. It feels stressed. When a child says to us, I don't get it, they're not kidding. They're saying, this is not making sense because the connections are not there. And when the child feels stress, then you have an inhibition, a barrier to the learning that we're really talking about here. So the more we can make those connections for students to those frames, the neurotransmitters that are strengthening the learning happen as opposed to the reverse of that. So why am I spending so much time here? Because the idea is when we get illuminated about how the brain works, how we can expand a child's frame of reference, then not only will we expand belief in that potential, but we'll start choosing the practices and creating the structures that allow these students to demonstrate those particular strengths. Next slide. So the other thing I want to share here, I had shown this slide before, but if you look at the bottom, for those of you who are superintendents or principals in schools and you say, well, you know something, we don't have exactly that problem. We only have a few students or a lower percentage of students who are underperforming. As a matter of fact, we're doing okay. We're worried about those students, but overall we have pretty decent achievement. What I will tell you is what we've also learned about the brain is that all of us use very limited capacity, only 10 to 20% of the real full capacity of the brain. So think about that. If everybody is really not focusing or being able to be tooled to this high performance, what is it, what I'm sharing, the kinds of things that we're talking about, starting with strengths, making connections to the cultural frame of reference, will help all children boost up the capacity of their brain. So if you have children who are, let's say, at the 90th percentile, how come they're not at the 95th percentile? Or how come that's not being manifested in the application in the classroom to motivation, to personal learning? What's happening there? Again, it's the need to make these connections. And the last where you'll see the 30%, this is an important data point here, and that is that often people talk about the capacity of the brain is inherited, it's genetic. And what we also know that only 30% of genetics plays a part in intellectual development. That means 70% is based on what students get exposed to, how students' higher order thinking skills are developed, and the opportunity for them to actually apply this learning in real life inquiry. Not a textbook, but how do you take what you're learning and make the connection to what's happening outside in the world? The last thing I will say about that, especially for those of you who are teaching adolescents, when students are saying what's happening in school doesn't reflect what's happening out in the world, they're often very accurate. Our job is to even let them tell us how do they see some of these things connecting? What would help them make those connections stronger? That's a discussion, and some of what we look at in terms of changing practice is getting into deep discourse with students so they can push forward their ideas, they can get what they're looking for in terms of feedback and time for reflection. Next slide. So I also share this slide with you because what you'll see there is, or who you'll see there is the man who was my teacher, Reuven Feuerstein, who was a student of Jean Piaget. So his work is in cognitive psychology, and his work came out way before there was anything called neurobiology, neurosciences. But he said, and I love the quote at the bottom, change the input and the brain changes accordingly. In other words, give children more enrichment, more opportunity to pursue their intellectual frontier, the skills or the strategies to support them doing that, then the brain is going to do likewise. It will reach for higher levels naturally. So what we're doing here is trying to make some points much more obvious that will illuminate the directions that we take. So to be culturally competent in this work, because when we say all means all, we're looking at trying to get to that frame of reference. What's really important is in a school district to make sure that we get people are moving from what they may be totally unconscious about, like starting with strengths, like moving to a cultural frame of reference, like doing higher order, explicitly working in higher order thinking skills, moving from that unconscious to a real awareness about why this is so important, and moving from that awareness to a self-awareness. How do we get teachers being more self-aware of what their choices are? And the last thing is, how do we make children more aware of their innate capacity? So I know I just got a sign saying that I have only 3 more minutes here. So Anne, I'm just going to ask you to push the next slide up. Yeah, this is it. So this is where I'm going to end. And that is this whole idea that when we come to our work wanting transformation, we start by saying we're going to look at how we gift all students, meaning those things that are going to push them to the highest level. And we know as parents what's important. We know enrichment is important. We know having deep discussion is important. We know giving students opportunities to really grow and go through inquiry. We know that. Then if we put those things into place, that's our intention. So in other words, when we go, we set an intention. If high intellectual performance is what the intention is, then we are more keen about what we should be paying attention to. And that is what hopefully we will be able to talk about in the next session we have together. What is it that's critical for to be paid attention to, so that we can make this intention of high intellectual performance a reality for all children. So all will really mean all. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Yvette. That was incredibly enlightening. And as mentioned, there will be another opportunity to hear from Yvette on November 18th with another Google Hangout, and she will be joined with the superintendent of a district that is actively and strategically pursuing the ideas that you've been learning about in this session today. So that should be extremely interesting.
Yes, I'm glad you brought that up.
Thank you. Anne, did you have any final words? I guess apparently she's muted.
Okay.
But you know, again, really appreciate this opportunity to begin to learn from the vast insights that Yvette has been able to accumulate in this incredibly important area in terms of the work that we're engaged with and trying to advance equity and educational excellence. And thanks everyone who was able to join us today.
Thank you. Thank you.